I want to talk with you for a little bit about one of my favorite dead people, Jonathan Edwards. While I'm not an expert on Edwards, obviously, if I can encourage you to read a little more of what Edwards has to say, it will be worth it because I know he's made such a tremendous impact in my life. It's given him a little too much credit, probably, but I sometimes say Jonathan Edwards moved me to Africa. And that's not all that unusual, actually, for Edwards to motivate people to missions. He served as a missionary himself for 7 years to the Native Americans, and he wasn't maybe the world's best missionary, but there's no question that one of the results of his ministry was an explosion in missions activity. 1700s, Great Revival, 1800s, missionaries being sent out across the globe, and in America, those who were sent out as missionaries were coming from what they called New Divinity Schools, which basically means schools led by disciples of Jonathan Edwards. So Adoniram Judson, for example, was a student at one of those schools. His father was trained under Joseph Bellamy, one of Edwards' closest friends. And of course, it wasn't just America sending out missionaries either. Edwards' writings, one man explains, were extremely influential in the beginnings of the modern missionary movement in both England and Scotland as well. One author writes, if the two major sources behind 19th century Anglo-American missions could be isolated, a convincing case could be constructed for there being the theology of Jonathan Edwards and the example of David Brainerd. And Edwards' theology, in particular the book he wrote on the freedom of the will, had a huge influence on Andrew Fuller, specifically as he struggled against hyper-Calvinism. And God used Edwards to set Fuller free to play the role he did in enabling and supporting the ministry of William Carey. Which is why some people say if you're going to call William Carey the father of modern missions, then you have to call Jonathan Edwards its grandfather. His ministry had that kind of influence, even here in Africa. In his book, Missionary Labors and Scenes in Southern Africa, Robert Moffat speaks of President Edwards. There's a Jonathan Edwards Center in the Free State, and they're tracing his impact on missionaries who came here. And so I think it's appropriate for us to talk about Jonathan Edwards and his worldwide impact on missions, and the difference he might make in the way we think about missions and missionaries. We're not the first Christians. There are great and godly men who have gone before us, and we should want to learn from them. In fact, recently I was asked to speak at a conference, and the title I was given for the message I was asked to deliver was something like, "What would Jonathan Edwards say to Africa?" And that was nice of the conference organizers. They had high hopes for me, but the reality is Edwards was a genius, and I'm not. They've called him America's greatest philosopher, the greatest mind America ever produced. Some in his day said he was perhaps even the most profound thinker in the entire world, and I promise you no one's ever called me that, except maybe my wife if I ask her nicely. So don't think I'm going to be writing a book, What Would Jonathan Edwards Have to Say to Africa, anytime too soon, but he's definitely worth thinking about. Not so much because he was a genius, but mostly because he was always thinking as hard as he could about God. If you love to think about God, you'll love Jonathan Edwards. I don't know if there have been many others who have thought as deeply about God as he did. This was his life-dominating passion. You could say Edwards was a man of one great idea, and that idea was God. In fact, you know sometimes how when you're reading the Bible and you're in a difficult passage and you don't know what to get out of it, you just say, what does it say about God? At least I can start there. And you know if you do that, you're going to get something good. The same is pretty much true with Jonathan Edwards. If you ever wonder what he's about, you're in a difficult section of his writings, you can guess it has something to do with the supremacy of God, and you're most likely right. The essential principle in Edwards' thought, George Marsden has written, was the sovereignty of God. And it's not just that he thought about God either, or that he was this genius thinking deep thoughts about God. It was that he loved God. That's what makes him so compelling. It's not just that he shines light, he provides heat. He loved God's being God. For him, this was one of the pivotal moments in his conversion. And I want to talk a little bit about Edwards' love of God's being God, and the difference that makes on the way we think about missions in the next time we get together.